Everywhere and often, you'll hear conservatives complain about political influences within their lives and media. That is, of course, unless the current political influences within Christian discourse are concerned. Yet time and time again, Pope Francis says or does something that opposes the predominant Christian status quo, and the beginning of 2024 was no exception. Not only did he meet with Marxists who cooperate against corruption, but he is far from the first pope with progressive tendencies, let alone the first instance of Christian progressivism. This video will feel like a familiar timeline of events relevant to Christianity's history, with both suggestible and contextual inferences of Christian progressivism highlighted throughout. The further we explore Christianity, the more unreasonable and unchristian the status quo will seem, and the more obvious the thousands-year conflict among Christians will be. Words that I'm not confident about will appear on the screen while I potentially butcher them. Additionally, this video is not arguing that Christianity is inherently progressive or conservative, but was made firstly to reveal progressive elements that the religion and its history are often not recognized for, and secondly, as a consequence of that goal, to share the conclusive narrative made upon doing so. With that out of the way, and without further ado, let us dig deep to uncover the progressive roots of Christianity. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Wait, that's too far back. The most relevant parts as far as human history is concerned begins with a relative of Noah named Abraham, leaving behind one of the first civilizations, Ur of Mesopotamia, to diverse and foreign lands he called Canaan. His descendants became what is known as the 12 tribes of Israel, and a favored grandson would end up being tricked and sold into Egyptian slavery by jealous siblings. The Egyptians would eventually locate the rest of the Israelites until they too were enslaved. It isn't until Moses and Joshua arrive to size up the Pharaoh and lead the Israelites to Mount Sinai, where God bestowed upon Moses a series of rules we now call the Mosaic Laws. These laws were both progressive for their time and aligned with what many modern leftists still advocate for to this day, like a clear demand to accept immigrants without expecting to assimilate to the host country's cultures in Exodus 22:21, when it says, "You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the lands of Egypt." To me, it is a clear message against assimilation in addition to accepting immigrants, because the Israelites would not have liberated themselves had they abandoned their faith and assimilated into Egypt. It demands them to never forget how they felt in foreign lands, and to give to immigrants what they did not receive, who often have their own reasons for immigrating that the Mosaic Laws themselves get into as follows. Bring all the tithes of that year's produce and store it in your towns, so that the Levites, foreigners, fatherless, and widows, who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. And if anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted towards them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. While a direct comparison of their economy to modern ones might seem anachronistic, reducing the specifics to what they are helps us understand the similarities between what they and modern progressives both want: equality, acceptance, welfare to the poor, and financial security for all. This sentiment is only echoed with additional measures both they and modern progressives consider necessary and considerate, like demands against lending, fraud, theft, coercion, and worker exploitation, as it reads. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor, nor exact interest from them, nor shall you defraud your neighbor, steal, or keep for yourselves the wages of a laborer. And when you reap the harvest of your land, do not make clean riddance of the corners of thy field when you reap it, nor gather any gleaning of thy harvest. Instead, leave them for the poor and to the stranger. And finally, a way to redistribute wealth is ensured on the year of Jubilee that goes, "You shall consecrate the 15th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you, when each of you shall return to their property, and each of you shall return to their clan. The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. For you are strangers and sojourners with me. And if your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you." Especially rare for the times, though imperfect, was the allowance of women to have property, animals, and servants. These laws are a Semitic innovation of humanism and shared responsibility that mimics the outcries of the modern left. None of these laws, however, would be experienced until Moses died and Joshua took over, who returned the people back to Canaan where the tribes lived essentially unified after him, aided by a collection of de facto leaders that marked the era of judges, who offered political and military guidance in times of need. This collective society functioned relatively well until populism got in the way. That is to say, when the first king named Saul was crowned for doing well to help defend against the raiding Amorite kingdom. Unlike the era of judges, which was more stable and divided power to specialized positions that the people had more say over, the transformation into a kingdom created a vulnerable snake that mutated into a hydra the moment King Saul was slain. With this society reorganized and redirected to a central authority and state, people were led away from their common needs towards a distracted political game they did not benefit from. Ishbosheth was the chosen successor of King Saul, who was immediately cooed by Saul's son-in-law King David. David would then blame the famines they experienced on Saul's actions, allowing the local Gibeonite people to execute 7 of Saul's descendants as a form of justice for what he did as well, and in doing so, caused the kingdom to split into the 2 kingdoms of Israel and Judah. They wouldn't see unity for centuries, and when they did, it was not for just reasons, but between mutual interests among its rulers, who enjoyed their geopolitical trade position between Egypt and Assyria. The people felt the wealth being put in place of them, and many radical prophets would speak out against the kingdoms and the ruling class, many of whom inspired Jesus and his followers a millennia later. One prophet was a shepherd named Amos who said, "You trample on the poor, take levies of grain, build houses of stone you shall not dwell in, have planted pleasant vineyards you shall not drink. Hear this, you who trample on the needy, and bring the poor of the land crying, when will the new moon be over that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath that we sell wheat, that we may make the wheat bushels small and the coin great, and deal deceitfully with false balances, that we may buy the poor for silver and the needy for sandals and wheat. Let justice roll like waters, the righteous an ever-flowing stream." A farmhand named Micah shared a similar sentiment. "The Lord is coming out of his place and will tread upon the earth, all for the transgression of Jacob and the sons of the house of Israel. Her images shall be beaten, her wages burned with fire, her idols I will lay waste. For her wound is incurable. It has come to Judah. It has reached the gate of my people to Jerusalem. Those who devise evil deeds on their beds, when the morning dawns, they perform it because it is in their power. They covet fields and seize them, houses and take them away. They oppress householder and house, people and their inheritance. Listen, heads of Jacob and rulers of Israel. Should you not know justice? You who hate the good and love the evil, who tear the skin off my people." Followed by Hosea, the most dramatically written, who said, "Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more its fruit increased, the more altars it built. As the country improved, it improved his pillars. Their heart is false. Now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down their altars, destroy their pillars. Now we say, we have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. And a king, what could he do for us? They utter mere words. With empty oaths they make covenants. They multiply falsehood and violence. And they make treaty with Assyria, and oil is carried to Egypt. A traitor in whose hands are false balances. He loves to oppress. Ah, I am rich. I have gained wealth for myself. In all of my gain, no offense has been found in me that would be sin. God from the land of Egypt will make you live in tents again, as in the days of the appointed festival. Now they keep sinning, and make a cast image for themselves, idols of silver, the work of artisans. Sacrifice to these, they say. People are kissing calves. I will destroy you, O Israel. Who can help you? Where is your king that he may save you? Where in your cities are your rulers? Compassion is hidden from my eyes. And the one cited by Jesus the most was prophet Isaiah, who wrote, "Sinful nation, people laden with iniquity, offspring who do evil and deal corruptly, who had forsaken the Lord, who were utterly estranged. Learn to do good, to seek justice, to rescue the oppressed, to defend the orphan, and to plead for the widow. This corruption is not the kind of fasting I have chosen, to loosen the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke. Is it not to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry, and provide the homeless shelter? When you see the naked, to clothe them, and to not turn away from your own flesh and blood?" These words came from the mouths of the working class, who used religion and prophecy as a medium for protest. all during the supposed golden age for the two kingdoms in question, and a testament to how good economies often referred to good for the ruling class in the negligence of their subjects. Though inspiring for generations and embedded into the Judaic faith, it would not be agitated prophets and masses that succeeded the two kingdoms. Towerless and finally intelligible, it was instead the Neo-Babylonian Empire that aided their downfall. Then the Persians took over, Alexander the Great after that, and after a long game of big fish little fish, settled in the hands of the Seleucid Empire by 312 BC that formed out of Alexander's generals. Its king Antiochus IV, like the land's previous owners, subjected its inhabitants to religious oppression and the desecration of the Temple of Jerusalem. Enough was enough, and soon arose a particular family who put it into their own hands to give the people a taste of independence. The forerunner of this revolutionary movement was Matthias Jonin, whose sons led a guerrilla war against their occupiers. One to stand out would be his son Judah, who earned the name Maccabee, meaning the hammer, and championed what came to be called the Maccabean Revolt. They accomplished many victories, and eventually restored Jerusalem and its temple in 164 BC on December 14th, forever remembered as Hanukkah. The only resistance to this independence was a minor group of Jews known as Hellenists, who favored the byproducts of their former occupation. Most devoted to that occupation was a priest named Alcimus, who murdered the group's high priest, Menelaus, and executed 60 other priests that refused to support him in his Seleucidian sympathies. Seeing just how unfavorable his actions were, he cowardly fled to the heart of the Seleucid Empire, where he convinced the later king Demetrius I's daughter to reconquer what was lost. This resulted in the sending of more generals and troops, who too were defeated by the Maccabean cadre. The Romans took notice as they expanded east, and decided to make a proxy out of Judah, who reluctantly agreed to the Roman-Jewish treaty. Unthreatened, or perhaps the exact opposite, King Sauter I responded with 20,000 soldiers who overwhelmed the insurrectionists at the Battle of Elassa, ending Judah in 160 BC and solidifying their rule once more. Judah's brother Jonin was the next person the people looked up to, who surrendered to the Seleucidians to both lighten their punishment and buy the movement some time. It spared them for a moment, while Jonathan conspired with a wannabe king named Alexander Ballas. But after helping him take over the Seleucid Empire, he himself was spared no longer, instead betrayed, captured, and executed. The Romans eventually defeated the Seleucidians themselves and gave the Judeans a taste of independence, only to install Herod the Great, who was more loyal to the Romans than to his Jewish blood. He began to lose grip of his power and sanity by 4 BC, after brutally assaulting the lands to secure compliance, and making many enemies in the process. He'd go on to desecrate their temple in Jerusalem, and burn 2 Jewish martyrs at the stake, who risked their lives trying to undo the desecration. The not-so-great Herod finally died, and King Archelaus teased some hope by lowering taxes and arresting the former king's loyalists, but imprisoned suspected Jewish agitators all the same. Unmoved, the Judeans resorted to violence, and King Archelaus went full mask off in response by slaughtering 3,000 people seeking liberation. Ancient historian Josephus' brave accounts of the Archelaean revolt are reinforced by King Archelaus' proclamation that announced the cancellation of the Passover feast. This sparked revolts in Galilee, Idumea, Jericho, Perea, and Jordan. As Josephus put it, there were 10,000 disorders in Judea in warlike posture, of hopes to gain themselves of enmity. Now Judea is full of robberies, as several companies lighted upon anyone to head them. Revolutionary leaders Judas of Hezekiah and Simon took over the city of Sepphoris, distributing its food, wealth, and weapons to the people, burnt down Jericho's royal palace, and plundered several other noble houses across the country. As the saying goes, every revolution has its counter-revolution, as the Romans rallied 2 legions between Syria and Arabia Petraea under Governor Publius Varus, who reconquered Galilee and Sepphoris. Its inhabitants enslaved, and the cities burned after. During this event, just 4 miles, or 6.4 kilometers for the rest of the world, away, the young couple Joseph and Mary traveled to Bethlehem to complete a census and birth Jesus along the way. Meanwhile, the Romans continued marching to Samaria, burned down a mosque, and retook Jerusalem with the crucifixion of 2,000 suspected agitators. After so much defeat and hopelessness, it was time for a revolutionary figure to rise up and become the martyr the people needed. Growing up in the humble town of Nazareth with his hard-working Jewish family, Jesus showed signs of his calling during childhood, when found debating the religious leaders in Jerusalem's temple on one Passover. While not much is known between then and his baptism, it's undoubtful that he witnessed his oppressed neighbors and their complaints of the empire. He received his baptism around 28 AD, and like Buddha gaining nuance as a rich man to poor, found great wisdom mimicking a starving vagabond's life in the desert. He joined the ministry as a prophetic healer soon after, and committed many miracles before returning to his hometown. At its synagogue there, he claimed to be the successor of Prophet Isaiah, reciting, "The Lord has anointed me, sent me to bring good news to the oppressed, to bind the brokenhearted, liberate captives and prisoners, to proclaim the Lord's favor and vengeance, to enjoy wealth of the nations. Because shame of the oppressed was double, and dishonor was proclaimed as their lot, they shall possess a double portion, everlasting joy shall be theirs." He was chased out of town for this claim, despite his intentions, and so he and his followers left to base themselves in the town of Capernaum, Galilee. With further organizing and healing, they'd grow quite the reputation as Jesus separated himself from the Jews at the Sermon on the Mount. Few realized just how radical the message to make it on earth as it is in heaven was, what it implied against the nations and rulers of the world, and against the notion that longing for a better one would not be dissuaded by distant pie-in-the-sky promises, declaring, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of God. Blessed are those who hunger for righteousness, for they will be fulfilled. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are you, when people revile you, persecute you, utter all kinds of evil against you, in the same way they persecuted the prophets before you. So do not worry asking, what will we eat, drink, or wear? Indeed, God knows that you need these things, but strive first for the kingdom of God, and all these things will be given to you as well. Do not store treasures on earth, for your heart is where your treasure is. And no one can serve two masters. For a slave will either hate one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and wealth." His words were not mere poetry, but a manifesto against the status quo, equilibrium of power, and oppressive systems of the day. A blueprint for the living, as Jesus said, "The kingdom is at hand, it is within reach," as well as a clear statement against the accumulation of wealth that makes the nations. Those who bystood and carried on the tradition of unconditional custom, honor, and power were also subject to his scrutiny, reinforced further when Jesus was ironically invited to join a dinner with officials, scholars, and lawyers, who were strict Jewish practitioners known as Pharisees. Their attempt to insult him fueled his analogy to criticize them, that was, "You clean the outside of the dish, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. Fools, woe to you who tithe the herbs but neglect justice and God's love that you ought to have practiced. You love the seat of honor in the synagogues and respect in the marketplace." An insulted lawyer had had enough, but failed to realize how enough an insulted Jesus was, backfiring. "Woe also to you lawyers! You load people with burdens and do not lift a finger to ease them. Woe to you for building the tombs of the prophets your ancestors killed. God said, I will send them prophets and apostles, some of whom they will persecute and kill, so that this generation may be charged with the blood of all the prophets shed since the foundation of this world. Yes, you will be charged against this generation, for you have taken away the key of knowledge you failed to acquire yourselves, and hindered those who were acquiring." All they could do was respond with judgment, waiting for the moment he would slip up and say something they could cancel him for. This would not be his only savage moment. On one particular Sabbath, which has similar strict obligations to Catholic Lent for those that need the reference, led his followers through someone's field, snacking on the crops along the way. Pharisees were there to see it and accused them of breaking the laws on the Sabbath, saying, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath," to which he defended, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence for the priests. Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break it and yet are guiltless? I tell you, there is something greater than the temple here. If you knew what Hosea meant by, 'I desire mercy and not sacrifice,' you would not have condemned the guiltless." With a spiritual mic drop, he'd leave them and enter their synagogue. They followed, cynically asking if he'd unlawfully cure a man's damaged hand or let him suffer. Unfazed, he replied, "Suppose one of you has a sheep fall into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not let it out? How much more valuable is a human than a sheep?" Then he asked the man to give him his hand, mocking, "Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath?" Then restored the hand and took his leave. Jesus criticized wealth holders again in Judea when a noble approached him. When asked what laws were important to follow, he mentioned all commandments. And when the noble clarified he had done all those things, Jesus said, Go, sell your possessions, give the money to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven. The man left in disappointment, to which Jesus said to his disciples, Truly, I tell you, it will be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. Truly, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for someone who is rich to enter the kingdom of God. Despite once saying that his burdens were light, Jesus had collected many enemies among the rich, the authorities, and the Jewish leaders who felt their thrones bellowing with every step he took. Once in Jerusalem, his followers seized the temple, overthrew its vendors that sought to profit from desperate pilgrims, and indirectly threatened the chief priest for the inheritance with a parable that described how there was a landowner who planted a vineyard, put a fence around it, dug a wine press in it, and built a watchtower, then leased it to tenants and went to another country. When harvest came, he sent slaves to the tenants to collect his produce, but they seized the slaves and harmed them. Again he sent other slaves, more than the first, and they treated them the same. Finally he sent his son, whom they killed for the inheritance. Before finishing, Jesus asked the high priest what would happen to the tenants when the owner finally sent himself, and they replied, He will put those wretches to a miserable death, and leave the vineyard to better tenants who will give the produce he deserves at harvest time. But it was a rhetorical question, so he said, Have you never read the scriptures? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it is amazing in our eyes. Therefore, I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to people that produces the fruits of the kingdom. The priests finally grasped that Jesus referred to them in his parable, but held back the desire to arrest him in fear of the mob that was growing and listening. All they could do was allow the occupation of the robber's den, and all their attempts to stump Jesus proved as fruitless as the fig tree he cursed there.
Jesus Christ was a man who traveled through the land, a hard-working man and brave. He said to the rich, give your goods to the poor, but they laid Jesus Christ in his grave.
Rather than self-improve, they proved Jesus right when they bribed the disciple Judas Iscariot to turn him into the authorities. Not even the Roman executioners could comprehend why the Pharisees were against such a renowned and shining example of virtue, but alas, he was tried by the world's most biased jury and crucified. His wealthier allies Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus helped afford Jesus a proper preparation and burial. Authorities did their best to secure the tomb, but the body ascended regardless. Of these allies, Nicodemus is alleged to have written his own gospel, whose authenticity is debated and considered non-canon. Despite this, the gospel was incredibly popular and accepted among many Christians up into the 10th century and merely serves as an extension of what Jesus had already advocated. You have crucified me, have divided my garments among you, and made prayers for my name's sake. You have fulfilled the prophecy. And now I say to you, the poor and the maimed, blind and the lame, who have believed in and kept my commandments, are heirs of the kingdom. They that have riches in this world, have not given alms, and not kept my commandments, are children of darkness. They killed his body, but not his spirit. Many would say literally. Indeed, it flowed through his followers, and thousands more joined them. It is to these new Christians that Peter said to them, Save yourself from this corrupt generation. And thus, those who welcomed his message were baptized, and that day about 3,000 people followed. All who believed were together, and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods, and distribute the proceeds to all men, for all men had need. To which John followed with, Do not be astonished, brothers and sisters, that the world hates you. We know that we have passed from death to life because we love one another. How does God's love abide in anyone who has the world's goods, sees a sibling in need, and yet refuses to help? Let us love not in speech, but in truth and action. And in truth and action they followed. For now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but was held in common. There was not a needy person among them, for as many owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds, and were distributed to any in need. Such a communal society successfully broke social, cultural, and economic barriers, both for the apostles and the thousands who lived in defiance of the empire and its imperial pantheon. The Romans barely allowed autonomy to the Jews who were in line with their interests, so the commune's attempted coexistence would not last. First came the execution of the beloved Saint Stephen along Jerusalem streets. Then Paul would get imprisoned between missionary work and for saying, Do not conform yourself to this world's systems of things, but change yourselves by using your own intellect, so that you shall understand by yourselves the good and perfect will of God. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, and against the powers of darkness. As the first Christian commune dissipated, more took its place. A group known as the Desert Fathers, who went out of their way to avoid conflict, were oppressed nonetheless and took refuge in the Egyptian deserts, where communes were formed and wealth fetishizing was criticized. Another group known as Ebionites, which means the poor ones, differed from the others with their veganism, continued Judaic practices in addition to Christ, and believed that Jesus was not destined to be God's son, instead earning his place as such through proven trials and temptations. When they too would be persecuted despite also living away from imperial society, they learned from the first commune and joined liberation movements, like the primarily Jewish zealots and Sicarii, preachers of revolution, who also assassinated key political figures. When Roman governor Florus stole the temple's treasury and suppressed peaceful Jewish demonstrations, the Great Jewish Revolt ignited. Rome responded with 5 legions between generals Vespasian and Titus, the war lasting 7 years and ending with the siege and destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, as Jesus prophesied. It's an understatement to label this campaign brutal, as the aforementioned ancient historian Josephus claimed that hundreds of thousands were enslaved and over 1 million rebels were killed. Afterwards, all Jews were heavily taxed no matter their involvement in the revolt. Many dispersed to Libya and Greece, which became the birthplace of the Kitos War in 115 by Lucuas of Cyrene. This rebellion started strong as many of the outlying Roman territories were claimed, along with an alliance between the Jews and the Parthian Empire, who saw Rome as their mutual adversary. Unfortunately, General Lucius the Butcher did not earn his nickname for owning a popular meat shop, but instead for ending the war just 2 years later, including the death of 200,000 rebels, 240,000 civilians, and the erasure of the Cypresian, Cyrenaian, and Alexandrian communities. Adding insult to injury, Emperor Hadrian announced plans to establish a colony upon Jerusalem that would be desecrated in the process, and forced the already despotic Jews into yet another revolutionary war, the Bar Kokhba revolt. Prophet Bar Kokhba and Rabbi Akiva did their best to inspire hope and freedom in the eyes of many, but after hundreds of razed villages, farms, and water sources, the war was over by 136 AD. The intensities against Jews, Christians, pagans, and other minorities alike rarely died down, only reinforced into systemic genocide after the edict of 249 AD by Emperor Decius that required all citizens to sacrifice in his name or face prosecution. While the battle for independence and freedom of expression waged on between oppressor and oppressed, the ruling class of Rome had been experiencing their own battle in trying to figure out how to maintain the state without suffering their interests, thus splitting power between 4 emperors. Following his brutal trend of 4s, he declared 4 edicts that allowed the removal of temples, scriptures, and religious figures, in addition to mandated sacrifices as done before that now needed to be proven. Only the Edict of Milan declared by Emperor Constantine in 313 AD stands out, and while he might have earned the title as the first Christian emperor, it is harder to argue that he did so out of good faith. First, becoming Christian in the selfish hope that God would help him win a battle, and secondly by playing God and picking favorites and harshly punishing the rest who disagreed with his interpretation. The empire that could not defeat them instead joined them to take over the narrative, using it to justify the things Christians had criticized them over for centuries. Christianity became something governed by an authority above the people, something Jesus would have been against when Matthew recorded him saying, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones are tyrants over them. It will not be so among you. But whoever wishes to be great among you must be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man came not to be served but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. But you are not to be called Rabbi, for you have one teacher and all are students. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted." The same emperor who institutionalized Christianity would be the one who regained absolute power over the empire, hindering many people's free will in the process. His subjects acted out of fear and punishment, instead of being good for the sake of good and choosing God for themselves. As for the other rulers, their motives in representing Christianity would also be obscured due to the actions of Constantine that empowered the clergy to receive considerable lands and wealth. So much so, as Christian historian Cynthia McClaskey put it, "It became thenceforth a sin to die without some inheritance to religious uses." And before a century had elapsed, the mass of property passed over to the church was so enormous that the vastful extravagance of the devout had to be restrained by law. Many rich men procured for themselves ordination as ecclesiastics to enjoy the immunities and privileges attached to clerical office. Like the kings of Israel and Judah, and like the noble Pharisees, The interest in representing Christianity diverged from the interest of God. Constantine's laws gave clergy money, power, prestige, and later on, the incentive of tax exemption status as well. Those who were prosecuted did not just lose their lives, but their property and possessions. For as many things seized under the justification of heresy, it's a wonder how many of these instances from profit-driven clergy came out of things like jealousy and personal accumulation. But what is clear is that by this point the church was a synonym for easy realtor business. Constantine was so dedicated to installing an absolute dictatorship and putting his interpretation of Christianity at the top that not even his own Nicene Christians could agree with each other. The Roman bishop and governor Ambrose of Milan believed that an equal society was the most just because there was little room for corruption if everybody's interests were for each other. And even he felt that Constantine was not a true Christian, along with the elites he surrounded himself with, saying, "What belongs to God is outside the emperor's power. How far will you push your frenzied greed? When giving to the poor, you are not giving him what is yours, rather paying him back what is his. Indeed, what is common to all, and has been given to all to make use of, you have usurped for yourself alone. The earth belongs to all, and not only to the rich. You are paying him back your debt. You are not giving graciously what you do not owe." As for what was done in the past when Jews and Christians experienced heightened persecution, they resorted to martyrdom, until a major part of North Africa would appeal to the Roman Council for their persecutions to stop and to be treated equally. It was denied. Millions were backed in a corner and supposed to allow their numbers to dwindle under constant scrutiny, and by 317 AD, their desire for self-determination was reduced to a schism. It was more than a schism, but a century-long protracted war that saw unity between dynastists, agonistics, Ebionites, and others, the combination of which became a major force of guerrilla fighters who liberated lands from landlords, distributed resources they seized for the masses, and attracted peasants and workers alike in the struggle. In the end, it wouldn't be the Roman Empire or Catholic Church that got to the resilient separatists of North Africa, but raids from a Germanic tribe called Vandals and Muslim monarchies that neighbored them. Christian peasants and runaway slaves called a Bugatti shared similar criticisms of the North African Christian rebels, leading their own rebellion in 435 AD that led to the takeover of Central Gaul, that was France, and the Ebro Valley, before being wiped out by General Aetius under Emperor Valentinian III just a few years later. A history thankfully preserved by the Christian historical writer Sylvanus, who wrote, "The misery of the Roman world is all due to the neglect of God's commandments and the terrible sins of every class of society. It is not merely that slaves and servants are thieves and runaways, wine-bibblers and gluttons, the rich are much worse. It is their harshness and greed that drive the poor to join the Bugatti and flee for shelter to the barbarian invaders." Had either of these prominent Christian insurgencies survived the Roman Empire's collapse just a few decades later, the outcome of Christianity as it is perceived today would have appeared entirely different, and likely way more progressive. Instead, the West had fallen, and with the capital in Constantinople, the bishop became the single most powerful ruler of Rome. Leo I claimed the throne of Rome in 440 AD, declared absolute power as the Pontifex Maximus, and insisted in being called Papa, the Father, beginning the tradition that started the papacy despite Jesus' insistence of only giving that title to God. Between the collapse, Leo I's convenient power moves, and a great influx of Germanic tribes, the clergy that remained standing in all its wealth and power became all too comfortable succeeding the Roman Empire. As Christian historian Chris Castaldo puts it, Christian rulers continued to grant estates and build large churches. The accumulation of these assets by the church was a natural function of the power vacuum left by the Roman Empire, but it required church leaders to manage large amounts of land and wealth, and practice the unsavory power brokering that went with them. After Leo I came Gelasius I in 492 AD, who went a step further in ensuring papal dominance with the assertion that the Pope's power was superior to kings, giving excuse to his divine right to it. No matter how popular the outcries, nor major the conflicts, the aristocratic minorities were above all judgment. All famines, catastrophes, and other potential signs of God's disapproval swept away with the temporal kings as the scapegoats. The Eastern Roman Empire experienced similar consequences of oppressing Christians, Samaritans, and the Jews. Between the genocidal Samaritan revolts in Palestina Prima from 484 to 573 AD, who experienced nearly 500,000 deaths, and the death of 30,000 Christians during Nika revolts in their attempt to overthrow Emperor Justinian I and his oppressive policies in 532 AD. Dissent and resistance had always been prominent in Christianity's history. The years following the 7th century were no different. But gone were the days where individual protests and uprisings were brushed away with edicts and declarations as calls for reformation reached a turning point. A significant instigator of the millenarian movement was Arnold of Brescia, who supported Italian communal movements that sought to distribute the lands among the people with mutual defense, cooperation, and elected councils. Expressing these views led to his exile by Pope Innocent II, who couldn't stop him from returning to Italy in 1144 and meeting with the Commune of Rome and its founder Giordano Leone, leading to a popular revolt that ousted the Pope and nobles in place of a free Roman Republic. The dream was crushed in 1145, however, by Pope Lucius II after leading constant assaults on the Commune. From the ashes of the Italian communes rose the Cathar Good Christians in 1209, who extended into Spain and France. They preached self-determination from the Catholic Church and echoed the teachings of Jesus and the first Christian commune in the Acts. When the movement gained some noble support, Pope Not-So-Innocent III led a crusade that slaughtered 1 million Cathars and destroyed the distinct Languedocian culture in 1229. It was this event that inspired Holocaust survivor Raphael Lemkins to coin the term genocide in the first place. When a wealthy merchant named Peter Waldo shared his possessions with the poor, he inspired a group of people who called themselves the Poor of Lyons, who too were persecuted, but fled into the Alpine mountains where they established interconnected communes that lasted centuries. John Wycliffe and his writings against intellectual gatekeeping was another major propagator of the Reformation era. His movement insisted that good faith could be ensured through Christ's righteousness alone, and separately appropriated the classes calling themselves the lowlords. Their doctrine rejected temporal wealth among church leaders, arguing that wealth creates pride and conflicting interests between it and faith. They supported the Great Peasant Uprising in 1381 across England, Kentish Insurrection of 1428 that seized several churches of Kent, and the Oldcastle Insurrection of 1431 by Lollard leader John Oldcastle after attempting to kidnap King Henry V. Because these actions were deemed heretical, thousands were burned at the stake. When Catholic priest and senior rector of the University of Prague, Jan Hus, read into John Wycliffe's text, he was invited in 1415 to a meeting that was a secret interrogation for suspected heresy. He refused to comply with the investigation, and so he too was burned at the stake with presumed guilt. This sparked the Hussite Wars in 1419 across Bohemia and Poland-Lithuania, whose organizers formed a moderate revolutionary junta who desired a fairer nobility. The people of the Mount Tabor region split from the Hussites, seized a town, mines, and workshops while denouncing all classes, taxes, and private property. The Hussites recognized and accepted them as they warded off crusades together, but with victory near, turned on the Taborites, killing several thousand and many by hanging. The Hussites won their war and gained concessions in 1436, making class differences ever more clear in their separation from the Taborites. All these uprisings caught attention of the European masses, who became more interconnected in their solidarity for self-determined governance and religious practice. But just as the sun was rising, and the fate of the papacy and Holy Roman Empire became turbulent, one man would preach the same until tasting the very wealth he originally criticized. Christian theologian priest Martin Luther, who came from a well-off family of mine leasers, also enjoyed John Wycliffe's writings, believing that reason was nothing without God. He practiced a poor ascetic lifestyle with little possessions, though later attesting to having done so as a form of spiritual self-harm than for noble reasons. His first controversy was in 1517, after he shared a thesis criticizing Pope Julius II's forgiveness vouchers to relieve his own debts, with his teacher Albrecht Brandenburg. The teacher reported him to the authorities where he was tried for heresy, to which he doubled down. Why does the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest Roman, build a basilica of St. Peter with the money of the poor believers rather than with his own money? And when asked if he denied his criticisms, he remarked, "I deny that the Pope is above Scripture," leading to his imprisonment, awaiting execution until his friend Christoph Langemantel broke him out. The Church's wrath would settle soon after Martin Luther used his notoriety to discourage the Great Peasant Revolt of the 1520s, and particularly criticized the Sabbatical prophets, who wanted others to live as Christ's return was imminent, as well as for true equality and emancipation. The rebels came from the most neglected and poor cities and fields, demanding socioeconomic justice, abolition of serfdom, and the right to elect their own religious leaders. Luther's friend Thomas Müntzer abandoned him for his critiques and led a revolt in the city of Mauthausen, where he was captured, tortured, and executed. The origins of Martin Luther revealed themselves more as he argued that patient hope for heaven was better than violence against oppression, and had the audacity to denounce peasants without acknowledging the violence permitted by the church and state, going on to say, "Baptism does not make men free in body and property, but in soul, and the gospel does not make goods common. Our peasants, however, want to make the goods of other men common, and keep their own for themselves." Yet Mr. Luther did nothing about the rich and noble he defended and surrounded himself with. To paraphrase Jesus, focused too much on the sawdust in the peasant's eyes without addressing the log in his own. The revolts continued anyway, and saw the organization of decentralized committees over the lands the peasants could conquer. Despite their numbers, the revolt ended in 1525 after over 100,000 peasants were slain. All peasants were punished in the aftermath with various rights reduced, taxes increased, and the absolution of any political representation. Due to the contrast between Martin Luther and the rebellious commoners, he is accredited for a reformation to the printing press he could afford, without considering just how great it could be to the masses if such means of production were allowed in common so that they too could get a voice. Later in life, Martin advocated for crusades against heretics, including critics of the Protestant states that he kickstarted. Indeed, he achieved what he wanted, a digestible, tolerable, pick-me kind of reform that compromised the masses, preserved the elites, and showed how he was civil and not like those other heretics, before ultimately realigning himself comfortably with the Catholic Church and its discount Roman Empire. Such a tragic revolt provided valuable lessons to future Christian martyrs determined to improve the world, including the earlier Anabaptists that similarly wished to restore the virtues and lifestyle between Jesus and the Acts. Radical prophets Bernhard Rothman, Jan Matthes, and Jan Bockelson attracted thousands to the city of Münster after promising absolute equality and great wealth to all, with criticisms of the Catholic Church in between. Wealthy merchant Bernhard Knipperdolling was elected mayor of the city in 1534, and afterwards banished the Lutheran aristocrats as another flavor of corrupt dogmatists, declared the city New Jerusalem, and as promised, shared all the wealth starting with the poorest while all property was held in common. Unfortunately, Bishop Franz von Waldeck and his crusaders chose to celebrate the death of the heretics over the death of Jesus when beginning siege on Easter Sunday, followed by the capture of Prophet Matthes and his head spiked and his genitals nailed. The city defended itself for a year, but could hold no longer by 1535 as its leaders were captured, tortured, and executed, their mutilated corpses left to hang in cages from St. Lambert's Church steeple that remains to this day. The Münster Rebellion's survivors organized a secret meeting to discuss future activities, which included a radicalized noble's son, Jan van Battenbier. The meeting concluded in holding off another rebellion, and outraged by this decision, Battenbier returned to the thousands he organized in the Netherlands known as the Sword Spirits. This group swore oaths of secrecy, endured painful rituals to withstand potential torture by Catholic interrogators, and like Robin Hood, robbed many of the well-off, giving the valuables to the poor in cities far from the crime scene. On a mission in Vilvoorde, Belgium, Battenbier was turned in to the authorities by his follower Cornelius Appelman, who watched his leader burn at the stake, and returned to the Sword Spirits claiming that he was chosen to lead them in his place. That is when the group fell out as Appelman tried to turn the movement into a criminal gang that mugged, racketed, arsoned, and murdered. What Cornelius the traitor gave was given to him as he would eventually be captured and burned by the stake as well, with his gang falling out by the 1550s. Many of these events and martyrs would not be available without the ambitious work of Christian historian John Fox, who, in 1563, wrote a thick 2,000-page book full of first-hand accounts and details of a variety of Christian rebels, with a name equally as gigantic, called The Acts and Monuments of These Latter and Perilous Days, Touching Matters of the Church. But most people just shortened it to the Book of Martyrs. Essentially, a black book of Christianity is credited as being one of the most significant factors that pushed Reformation by humanizing and detailing the outcomes and reasons behind so many so-called heretics. It saw many additions that continued beyond its writer's death, and while challenged by the authorities at the time, has been accepted by multiple modern historians as authentic and accurate. Around that time, King Charles V of House Habsburg ascended the throne as the latest Holy Roman Emperor. He sought to centralize the empire that was more or less a loose monarchical federation by that point, and declared war on reformers and heretics to solidify obedience to the Catholic Church. His son, King Philip II, continued these policies, and in 1566, the Habsburg-occupied Netherlands began to encounter considerable protests. When peace failed, they resorted to full-on resistance that became known as the Dutch Revolution by a sect of Protestants called Calvinists. The ruling house could only offer pitiful concessions that the rebels brushed away. After many battles and sieges took place, Pope Pius V installed Fernando Alvarez de Toledo, who became known as the Iron Duke. He purged suspected nobles in support of the rebellion, established the Council of Blood to persecute and execute heretics, and instilled heavy taxes on the people. Separate rebels in France known as the Huguenots joined the revolution that started there in the city of Utrecht by noble William von Oranje. The Iron Duke was relieved by King Philip II, and more pitiful concessions were made, but they too were not enough. More rebels rose up, including ones called the Watergeuzen, who began to occupy and defend neglected towns across the Netherlands, but were eventually brutalized by the Iron Duke's son Don Frederique. The new duke would be General Lucius de Racinsens, who thought trying concessions followed by violence would work a third time. So finally, a majority of the provinces unified their separatist opposition into the Dutch Republic. They went on to capture most of the region and seized many cities once thought impenetrable. Spanish states started becoming bankrupt from the protracted war, and de jure independence was granted by 1609. Holy Roman Emperor Matthias took the throne in 1612, who empowered Catholics across Bohemia and Hungary. Rebel Protestants seized the Prague castle out of fear and cooed the nobles and Catholic councillors, with many thrown out the window, initiating the Bohemian Revolt. Emperor Matthias himself died and was succeeded by Ferdinand II, who called about the Spanish and Habsburgs who had dire interest in protecting the Spanish road trade routes to Brussels. Austria joined the revolt next, but the Spanish, German, and English forces united to prevent another independent territory. They overwhelmed the rebels, ending the revolt in 1620, and maintained Catholicism there for centuries. Millions of ducats worth of possessions and properties were seized by the victors. Meanwhile, the Dutch Republic considered invading Brussels to devastate the Spanish economy and attempt to ally France to join them on this. But the French decided to invade South Netherlands instead in 1635 until Spain stopped them to recuperate. The dreadful stalemate, exhausted military, and drained funds forced the Spanish to give the Dutch a recognition of their independence in 1648, followed by considerable concessions. Though one could say that Christians had been engaged in a war for around 1,000 years, the disempowerment of the Catholic Church and its hegemony over interpretation finally reached an end with the resilience of the peasants, martyrs, revolutionaries, and conclusion of the 80 years long revolt. Martin Luther and imperial powers' calf-kissing efforts to calm the masses back into submission to reforms failed in the end against the formidable and persistent struggle for self-determination. The wealth holders through feudalism and monarchism did not itself end for many years, and even the considerations for more benevolent oligarchical republics resembled a kind of concession-making to preserve wealth and power in the wake of the Industrial Revolution. By 1700, House Habsburg was at a decline, and France's King Louis XIV usurped the Spanish throne. A lineage of Louis followed, each angering his people and nobles alike between their colony loss, ignoring of intellectual agitators, indebting of the country, and taxing commoners heavily. France's empire was also a clusterfuck of three branches known as estates, the highest being the clergy, who held a lot of control, tax exemption, and property ties. Below them were the nobles, who held similar status, and below both are the commoners, equally a clusterfuck of classes, but taxed in contrast, comprised of industrial workers, artisans, peasants, and merchants. Between trade barriers, mass inflation, famines, and inadequate reforms, the king summoned the Estates General to hopefully resolve the issues more effectively. His failing to allow all estates to congregate together made it all the more apparent for the commoners the difference between their interest and the interest of the wealthy. Instead, they formed their own National Assembly in 1789 that demanded a constitutional monarchy and comprised 98% of the population. In the countryside, insurrections erupted by peasant militias, who drove out landowners, with even the poorest of clergy joining them in the National Assembly. Thousands ended up marching to the Palace of Versailles, its royal guards arrested for refusing to fire upon them, and together, the marchers and rescued soldiers besieged the Fortress Bastille and its armories, with the governor's beheading the cherry on top. When the Constitution was finalized, it was riddled with contradictions from the start, as opportunists like Count Gabriel Riquetti, Marquis de Lafayette, Antoine Barnave, and others factionalized the assembly, plotted subterfuge for power, and pushed proposals through bribery. Some demands were carried out, like the nationalization of churches and the end of feudalism, but the Constitution also preserved property, tax exemptions, and many other privileges for the ruling class. The king refused to abandon the absolute monarchy, while many nobles and clergy fled France to plot counter-revolution with allies abroad. Soon the king gave in, left a little too late, and got captured by a village where he was sent to the National Assembly and coerced to accept the Constitution. The neglected masses who helped this come about began to protest, riot, and revolt again as they had done before. And so, the bourgeoisie that enacted the Constitution declared martial law in response to settle their power. Factions including Jacobin, Montagnard, and Girondin sprung up to take advantage of the agitated masses. The first two appealed to the people's demands, but the latter consolidated power for opposing brewing war with outside powers. Once in power, The Girondins immediately went to war with Austria, hoping to win war reparations with swift victory, but the Austrians and Prussians acquired leaked plans and devastated French armies that tried them. Pro-Republic Federalists initiated revolts across the provinces, and worried of losing their power, the Assembly executed the king and reformed it to a republic. The promise for a new constitution, like the promise to fulfill demands and evade war, was never realized. Factions of elites, meanwhile, demanded unrestricted property rights and hopped between various positions and factions in an attempt to pass whatever expedients they could. With little more than some price controls, the commoners wanted more than affordable bread and continued their protests, so the new government formed the Committee of Public Safety to put out such fires, declaring, "If by your incessant rebellion something befalls the representatives of the nation, Paris will be obliterated," which I think is what they wanted, but I digress. The Jacobins saw an opportunity and directed the masses into an insurrectionary coup that saw a few dozen officials slayed, until around 100,000 with 48 seized artillery surrounded the assembly buildings, while the Jacobin proclaimed, "The people are weary of seeing their happiness postponed. They leave it once more in your hands. Save them, or we declare that they will save themselves." As true as this was, once in power, and though they did appeal to some demands like lessened taxes and greater price controls, what wasn't in the fine print was the arrest of over 400,000 suspected enemies of the state, and an upwards of 140,000 executions that followed. The imprisoned and executed had their properties seized as the way of paying the government's debts and to solidify their authority, all the while drafting 1 million conscripts for the ongoing external war they promised to be against. This caused a hesitant stalemate among the enemies that feared their war effort would inspire their own people to consider revolt similarly as the French. And in the eye of the storm, the Jacobin junta created a state religion known as the Cult of the Supreme Being, both to replace Christianity and to enforce a sort of mystical deism that embraced purges and undid reforms. All while its leader Robespierre claimed to be the second Messiah. The Committee of Public Safety scrambled to remove the dictatorship, and the paranoid Robespierre retreated to a fortified complex with his loyal followers and guards. Its besieging led to a failed suicide attempt and a later execution, and with him out of the way, the assembly reformed into the Directory and caused their own reign of terror, executing thousands of suspected Jacobin. Though merely populist opportunists, the radical progressivism the Jacobin represented justified the Directory to be filled with moderates and conservatives that enabled General Napoleon considerable power, and as crazy as Robespierre was, his prediction, "slacken the reins of the revolution for one moment, and you'll see a military dictatorship," held true. With an economy on life support, 500,000 unemployed, millions more starving, and stability non-existent, the agitated, Catholic-raised, and Christian journalist writer François-Noël Babeuf began a popular newspaper called the People's Tribune, and created the organization Society of the Equals, that attracted many radical progressives, some of whom adopted the term socialist. They created the Manifesto of the Equals, declaring wealth holders and their profit incentive to be an obstacle of common good, advocating for absolute equality, abolition of private property, collectivization, and guaranteed food for all. Droves of supporters flocked to the Equalists, especially after the government pulled its plug and underwent national bankruptcy. A Christian socialist named Felipe Buonarroti proposed what an equalist society may look like and envisioned. The republic will be established by a large national community, inheritance abolished, property distributed to the national community, goods indulged collectively, each of its members with considerable accommodation, clothing, and food, and money will be the incentive of the republic no longer. Learning from the mistakes of the past, the Directory unfortunately infiltrated the Society of the Equals and eventually ordered 300-plus arrest warrants, with Babeuf executed and the rest deported in 1796. By 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte couped the Directory in place of royalists, who returned the absolute monarchy that caused the French Revolution to happen in the first place. Towards its end and in the face of adversity, a duke and businessman's son, Claude Henry de Saint-Simon, rose from a business betrayal that caused him to be impoverished and radicalized. He aspired to connect the world by canals, including the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans before Panama, fought in the Revolutionary War on behalf of the Americans, survived capture by the British, and formed a research institute upon his return to France. After losing his fortune, however, he became an industrial worker and used what money he scrapped to publish papers and books, advocated a Christian deism focused on improving the earth, and criticized the ruling class, despising their avoidance of work. His vision was a merit-based society organized by committees that specialized in certain functions including economic management and innovative sciences. Unfortunately, The lack of his work's attention led to multiple suicide attempts, miraculously surviving them all. Seeing this as a sign to continue his work, he continued one last piece before succumbing to his health, the New Christianity. It argued against the Catholic Church's view of reason, which was that if people are allowed to reason, then they can reason themselves out of religious devotion. It argued that reasoning out of devotion is the very purpose of free will, to separate the truest from the unwilling, and that morality should instead be enforced by communal fellowship and the merging of Christianity and the sciences for humanity's benefit. Despite continued depression, his final words were, "Our last work will be the last one understood. The Catholic system was in contradiction with the system of modern science and industry. Hence its downfall was inevitable. It takes place, and this fall is the signal of a new belief which will fill with its enthusiasm the void that criticism has left in souls." Little did he know that with a little time, his work would inspire so many, including a wealthy friend, writer, mathematician, and avant-garde arts founder Allende Rodriguez, who continued the ideas of Saint Simonianism. Allende also passed the torch on to his colleague Bartholomew Prosper Enfantin, who found the goal his true calling after being unsatisfied with many college and career prospects. He preached, wrote, and organized activism extensively, acquiring 40,000 followers to the cause, and helped in the July Revolution that led to King Charles X's exile. Enfantin befriended Saint Armand Bazard, a hardy individual left for adoption and then for the streets in his teens, only to rise up, earn the Legion of Honor, and become captain of the National Guard. He helped spread Saint Simonianism with his popularity in journalism, but had a falling out with Enfantin on the matter of women's rights. Bartholomew wanted women to have the right to divorce, vote, and join academics, but Bazard did not, and their arguments got so heated that Bartholomew punched the misogynist in the head hard enough to give him the neurological condition apoplexy. Unfazed, the Christian feminist led missions among the Ottoman Empire including women's rights, especially unfavored among the Islamists at the time, and was eventually persecuted until fleeing back for France where he spent his final years in preaching and activism. The arm of Saint Simonianism was Pierre Leroux, a poor writer and stonemason who founded the movement's main newspaper article, The Globe, but after hearing about Enfantin's feminism, did remove himself from the group unfortunately. Continuing on as a writer, he eventually joined the International Workingmen's Association at the invitation of Marx, where he asserted, "Man is composed of sensation, sentiment, and intellect. Social harmony results from the cooperation of these aspects, which are dissemblable in God in the form of power, love, and intelligence. In progressing towards a true democracy, we gravitate towards God." Among criticisms of the wage system and private property, he even managed to be elected mayor of a self-proclaimed autonomous town of Bassac that arose amidst the Revolution of 1848. The first notable usage of the term Christian socialist was between a British barrister of an East India Company family named John Ludlow and a deacon of the English church named Frederick Maurice. The two found a newspaper of the same name as well as the Workingmen's College in 1854. That was possibly named after the International Workingmen's Association that Marx and Engels participated in. The college was the first to admit women and raised charities for anyone that couldn't afford an education. The two also argued for women to be allowed powerful positions in religious institutions. Both radicalized by the United Kingdom's economic failings, Maurice dedicated most of his life writing over 40 volumes, notably The Kingdom of Christ and Moral and Metaphysical Philosophy. While the college attracted cleric historian Charles Kingsley, who helped establish many labor cooperatives across the country. Second-generation German immigrant Walter Rauschenbusch, like John Ludlow, was also prone to Christianity and became a pastor after receiving a master's in theology. Either in the early 80s or 90s, and upon his various trips to Germany, he learned of Marx and wrote about him in his 1907 work, Christianity and the Social Crisis, who argued, Marx and Engels were the first to give a clear and comprehensive statement of the economic interpretation of history. He traced the connection between the economic conditions and the political, legal, religious, and ethical development of mankind. They showed how the dominant class in each age had shaped the institutions and ideas of that age to fit its own interest. And what was that connection they made exactly? Well, in Marx's Critique of Political Economy, he declares, "This primitive accumulation plays in political economy about the same part as original sin in theology. Adam bit the apple, and thereupon sin fell upon the human race. In times long gone there were two sorts of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and frugal elite. the other lazy rascals, spending their substance and more in riotous living. This story of economic original sin reveals to us that there are people to whom this is by no means essential. Thus it came to pass that the former sort of accumulated wealth, and the latter sort had at last nothing to sell except their own skins. And from this original sin dates the property of the great majority, that despite all its labor, has up to now nothing to sell but itself. Such insipid childishness is every day preached to us in the defense of property. To which the Protestant remarked, "The socialists have been the most effective preachers of the social gospel, proclaimed the social wrongs more powerfully than the church has done, held up a vision of a new social order, a brotherhood of man, a reign of justice and love. They have created a new type of saints and martyrs, the John the Baptist of Christ." So while he thought that church and state should be separate, this was not the case, because to him, whoever uncouples the religious and the social life has not understood Jesus. Whoever sets any bounds for the reconstructive power of religious life over the social relations and institutions of men, to that extent denies the faith of the Lord. It was Marx who inspired Walter Rauschenbusch, and Walter inspired the Christian socialist Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., killed a week before his "Where Do We Go From Here" speech that preached for people to question the sources of oppression and consider violence where pacifism isn't an option. But before we get to the 20th century, just who was this Karl Marx?
2,000 years have passed and gone, many a hero too, but the dream of this poor carpenter remains in the hands of you, remains in the hands of you.
The man whose continuers of his work call themselves Marxists, the very people Pope Francis sought to cooperate with against corruption. Karl Marx was raised in a large Jewish family. His father, a converted evangelical and lawyer, encouraged him to come to his own beliefs on his own and think critically, rather than believe what he did for its own sake. Marx was baptized as a Jew at the age of 6, but wrote positively about Christianity in his teens. As for later in life, there's no need to gaslight that Marx remained faithful always in the ways many theists might prefer. But, as theologian Graham Oppy believes, Marx's position is a lot more nuanced, arguing, Karl Marx was not an atheist. Marx thinks one may deny this God or that and yet retain the underlying endemic to an alienated human existence. He went to some lengths to distinguish his philosophical system from properly atheistic ones. For Marx, the denial of the existence of God is incoherent. Marx insists that we cannot assume an absence of concrete being and then ask ourselves what exists in or proceeds from that absence. We must take the existence of the sensible world as a given bourgeois secularism. Marx argues, where the political state has attained its true development, man, not only in thought and consciousness, but in reality and life, leads a twofold life, a heavenly and an earthly life. Life in the political community, in which he considers himself a communal being, and life in civil society, in which he acts as a private individual, regards other men as a means, degrades himself into a means, and becomes the plaything of alien powers. The relation of the political state to civil society is just as spiritual as the relations of heaven to earth. Marx's point here is that atheist worldviews are not immune to the same religious process. One may regard the state as the perfect realization of human virtues and powers, even while those virtues and powers continue to elude the actual human beings who constitute the state. Marx's opposition is an opposition to any worldview that rests content with leaving the real isolation and powerlessness of human beings intact. For Marx, the defining question is not whether or not God exists. Rather, whether or not one affirms the flourishing of human individuals and community with one another as the highest value for human beings, and engages in a radical political practice aimed at the furtherance and concrete realization of this principle. As Graham Oppy concludes in Companion to Atheism and Philosophy, Marx was no anti-theist, and instead shared a rather sympathetic solidarity with those who were religious, especially when he said, "Religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of a real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the masses. It is the fantastic realization of the human essence, since the human essence has not acquired any true reality. The struggle against religion is, therefore, indirectly the struggle against the world, whose spiritual aroma is religion." So it's often frustrating when someone hears religion is the opium of the masses, and both A, does not look critically into it further, and B, fails to realize that the stigma from the opioid pandemic is a recent thing where opioids are still used positively in medical situations, and during Marx's time was an over-the-counter medicine for things from the common cold to a mild headache. In 1848, he and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, a short book meant to provide some brief aims, objectives, and explanations to the people of his time, the mid-1800s Prussians. While not the big seller on communism as many think it to be, it does include a nuanced, positive view of Christianity, despite being less religious by the time of writing it, saying, "Nothing is easier than to give Christian asceticism a socialist tinge. Has not Christianity declaimed against private property, against marriage, against the state? Has it not preached in the place of these? Charity and poverty, celibacy and mortification of the flesh, monastic life in Mother Church. Christian socialism is but the holy water with which the priest consecrates the heartburnings of the aristocrat." The compatibility of Marxism and Christianity is obviously subjective, so neither I nor any anti-communist believer could fairly assert in good faith. With that said, however, the Christian priest Andrew Miller wrote on this very subject worth considering. The common wisdom of both Christians and Marxists is that Christianity and communism are incompatible. When looking at the history of relations between the two ideologies, as well as the ideologies themselves, it is understandable why many come to this conclusion. Many Christians see Marxism a materialist, secular philosophy that is antithetical to all forms of spirituality, as well as inherently repressive. I would contend that both sides are incorrect in their assessment of one another, and that the time has come to build new bridges of reconciliation and solidarity between Christians and Marxists. Whether or not Marx would have believed that all things are composed of matter is besides the point. The most important aspect of Marxism is historical materialism. If we understand historical materialism in this way, we still leave open the possibility of immaterial reality. It is merely that, in terms of how history plays out, material reality has a certain priority. Engels in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific concedes that higher levels of historical materialist superstructure can exert causal influence over economics. I am required to believe in the existence of spirit. Nevertheless, it is undeniable that economics exerts a great influence over history than the activity of our own consciousness. And our consciousness itself has been to a large degree shaped by our particular relationship to the means of production. I see no necessary contradiction between this view and Christianity, so long as the Christian maintains that spirit does exist and exerts a certain non-historical priority over matter. Perhaps the first Christian Marxist was the first to translate the Communist Manifesto in the same year it was published, that being in 1848 in Sweden by a man named Pierre Gottschalk, a teacher, printer, and bookshop owner who started his interest with Saint Simonianism and ended up becoming a Marxist. The wiki claims he had no activism, but further digging reveals he participated in the theory of education known as pedagogy to improve childhood development, and in the political group Gothenburg's Arbetardenforening, the Workers' Association in English, who credited him as inspirational to the London Communist League in 1847 that Engels was in contact with. Gottschalk had written them a speech in 1850 that went, "Religion has been a zealous servant of the reigning political opinion. Thus we find in the time of flourishing individualism how the servants of religion regarded it as their duty to ceaselessly teach the oppressed masses to be submissive and patient. Let us focus on the priests of Jesus in this respect. Never have I heard anyone making this important issue the subject of any sermon. I am a communist. I am also baptized, for communism is a new name for an old thing, Christianity. For the true doctrine of communism really exists in the gospel of Christ." What has been held up to this point, however, was the liberties he took in giving a manifesto of theirs a Christian tinge, calling it the voice of communism, and changing the motto "Workers of the World Unite" into "The voice of the people is the voice of God." Gottschalk was well aware of the popular idea of religion being an ideological means to suppress the people, but unlike some, he did not imagine a society without religion as an alternative nor a bad thing, but the structure of religions and their enforcements that see that fruit. To him, the history of humanity is a battle between individualism, whose highest principle is everything for oneself, and brotherhood, whose chief principle is everything for each other. As historian Anton Jansen observed of this Christian Marxist, his critique of priestly deceit was not one of Christianity as such, but of the way Christianity has been conquered by the principle of individualism, which had led to priests being at the service of the interest of worldly powers, calling attention to the fact that the ideals and values supposedly inherent in Christianity, and partly still preached, are not attained or practiced by those who preach them, like the Pharisees. The Catholic Church, as an institution, has been under a lot of scrutiny in this video, both for its formation by the Roman Empire, support for it and other regimes, its causation of many atrocities, and its discrimination of non-Catholics historically. Even after the papacy chose to survive rather than fall with their feudal and monarchical allies, the Pope with the most progressive tendencies before Francis is furthest from infallible. Pope Leo XIII, known at the time as Gioacchino Bessi, displayed an affinity for theology at a very early age that allowed him to ascend the ranks of the church in his late teens. His first chance to do mass amounts of good was in 1838 in his role as papal legate over the small province of Benevento, Italy. They faced challenges of economic instability, rampant criminal activity, and dissatisfaction of papacy through protests and riots. Though crime is a product and reaction to disparity, and riots are the language of the unheard, Pesci offered an effective yet iron-fisted reaction. The arrest of hundreds of suspects, and several of them were executed by his orders that he'd later justify with, "The death sentence is a necessary and efficacious means for the Church to attain its ends, when rebels against it disturb the ecclesiastical unity, especially obstinate heretics who cannot be restrained by any other penalty from continuing to disturb the ecclesiastical order." A laughable statement of circular reasoning that translates to, "We will kill anyone that shakes our holdings beyond Rome because they are shaking it." At least as an archbishop, he founded homeless shelters, soup kitchens, banks focused on low-income families, and donated funds for a festival to support damages and victims of an earthquake and flood around the 1850s. 8 years after Marx's death and 3 years before Engels, the now Pope Leo XIII wrote a pamphlet on the rights and duties of capital and labor, known by its Latin name Rerum Novarum, meaning of revolutionary change, which earned him the nickname the Social Pope. Within it, he criticizes both liberal capitalism and revolutionary socialism, instead pushing for subsidiarity, that is, the idea that decisions should be made at the local level instead of a centralized authority, though I suppose that does not extend to the Church themselves when he said just a few years later, "We hold upon this earth the place of God Almighty. It is the Pope who must procure the good of the universal Church. The Pope is the supreme authority in the Church, and those who dissent from his teachings are cut off from Christ in the Church. All others subject to his coordination must assist the action of the Supreme Director and serve his purposes. As the Church is one, as its head is one, so are its governments, to which all must conform." This son of Count Ludovico Pesci came into the world with much inheritance, and rather than push his camel's self through the eye of the needle, he said in his capital and labor decree, "Whoever has received from the divine bounty a large share of temporal blessings has received them for the purpose of using them for the perfection of his own nature, and may employ them as the steward of God's providence. The law, therefore, should favor ownership, its policy to induce as many as possible, but not all, of the people to become owners." Though the lineage of people who lost their lands were interpreting Christianity differently, and the reparated conquerings of past colonizers and empires would disagree with that sentiment, which makes it all the more ironic when he later says, "Men always work harder and more readily when they work on that which belongs to them." After acknowledging the system he advocated for does not grant the betterment of everyone, the extent of his sympathy stops at the criticism of coercion when stating, if through necessity, of fear, or of a worse evil, the worker accepts harder conditions because an employer or contractor will afford him no better, he is made the victim of force and injustice. But this criticism of coercion is not consistent when he also says, "Let the working man and the employer make free agreements, and in particular, let them agree freely as to the wages." And while he advocates for economic safety nets as a worker's right in acknowledging the richer class has many ways of shielding themselves, whereas the mass of the poor have no resources of his own to fall back on and must chiefly depend on the assistance of the state. His gendering of the worker, however, was by intention, because to him, women are not suited for certain occupations. A woman is by nature fitted for homework, which is best adapted to preserve her modesty and promote the upbringing of children and the well-being of the family. Nor does his concern for rights extend to the Jews either, as the Jews, who were once the chosen people, have fallen into such a state of degeneration that they are hardly recognizable as human beings. The Jews, who were once the friends of God, have become his enemies. They have not only rejected Jesus Christ, but they have also done all they can to destroy the Church. And while supporting the secular republicanism in France and Prussia on one hand, he said on another, democracy, understood as the doctrine of the supremacy of the majority over the minority, and the denial of any transcendent or natural law, was a source of relativism, revolution, and oppression. The separation of church and state, understood as the exclusion of the church from any influence or participation in the affairs of the nation, was a violation of the rights and duties of both the spiritual and the temporal powers. He who would separate himself from the Roman pontiff has no further bonds with Christ, because the equal toleration of all religions is the same as atheism. The Catholic Church is the only true religion, and that other religions are either false or inferior. In terms of adaptability, one must reiterate analogously the ship of Theseus. Could the Catholic Church remain Catholic if its institution were to go against private property and class? For what that would entail would be a Catholic Church without hierarchy, without bequeathed property, without divine right as an earthly authority over humanity. Remove all of these things, and what is left is just Christianity. This, however, did not stop major Catholic figures from attempting to reform the Church in the mid-late 20th century that will be covered a bit later. Pope Leo XIII had also criticized America, of course, for its secular society, but that critique extended to all the Christians, including American Catholics, both who broke away from the canonical hegemony, probably wishing it was a century ago where the Holy See could justify launching armies of crusades to burn them all at the stake on the Pentecost, no doubt. Alas, and thankfully, his power was limited to enraged decrees, and so the many Christians taking advantage of the land of opportunity continued to put their ideas into practice. One of the first such efforts were by the Latter-day Saints. Its founder and author of the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith Jr., established the law of consecration in 1831. His vision was a society equal according to his family, equal according to his circumstances, his wants, and his needs. Inspired by these teachings, and looking to that of Jesus and the coming in the Acts, the Latter-day Saints formed the United Order of Enoch, which advocated for workplace democracy, common property, and guaranteed individual self-sufficiency. Each neighborhood was run by an elected and recallable bishop as well. Too radical for America's taste, they were coerced into conceding their principles or being denied property rights, and even after doing so, were persecuted for decades, even denied the proposed state of Deseret. The son of a farmer and deacon, Adin Balou, and his father were both radicalized for their poverty and father's inability to help his son pursue a proper education. This sent Adin down a path of self-determined autonomy in the face of expanding American authority. Between him and his religious colleagues, they afforded 600 acres of land and the construction of hundreds of homes, workshops, and institutions in 1843, all founded on the principles of common property, women's rights, abolitionism, and nonviolence. To guarantee pacifism, the commune was technically and legally a corporate town with each resident investing a share in the company as a roundabout way of achieving their utopia. This became their downfall after the town was bought out by the Draper Corporation, who turned the commune into a textile factory town. Like the United Order and the Hopedale community, two ambitious Christian socialists, Thomas Hughes and Franklin Smith, founded the Rugby colony of Tennessee in 1880. The area was described by them as a resort-like paradise, complete with many churches, a public library, parks, court for sports, perhaps rugby, and efficient block-style housing to guarantee the needs of its inhabitants. Its publicity via newspapers attracted near 500,000 people, all granted common property, personal liberties, housing, and reaped the rewards of their shared tourist economy, but also like the United Order and Hopedale community, were unprepared for the struggle to keep their independence. Between corporatists and the US government, constant land title lawsuits and dealings with bankers halted its development. The final nail in the coffin being pressure from companies bent on exploiting the land's resources, which killed it by 1900. One of the more prominent communal Christians to shake things up are the Shakers. Quakers known for their radical ideas that shook the mainstream of the time. Officially named the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, their existence as a millenarian movement hails all the way back to the mid-18th century in England, espousing the ideas of economic and social equality, feminism, ecstatic celebration, and utopian lifestyle. One of its founders, a cotton laborer named Anne Lee, took the movement from England to North America that peaked in the 1850s with 18 settlements and over 4,000 members. They produced reputable arts, innovative machinery, and high literacy education for all. But its attempt to coexist with the United States led to great exploitation of their resources during the American Civil War, and afterwards fell from competing with industries whose incentives were opposite of their own. While most of these communities were more idealistic in their endeavors, and this next one shares a similar fate, their structuring of society was arguably the most thorough, providing a decent blueprint for other would-be communal societies. John Humphrey Noyes was the son of Congressman John Noyes. Both served as ministers, while the son was radicalized by abolitionism and helped form the New Haven Project that became a bastion for escaped slaves to seek refuge. After majoring in theology, he became convinced that the second coming had already came and went, and that it was up to the people of earth to make it like it is in heaven. In 1848, he founded the Oneida Communes, composed of 48 administrations overseen by 27 delegated committees around New York State. Property was held in common, and many possessions were stored for those in need as promoted in the Mosaic Laws. The communes required work of those who could, helping its members achieve an education to fulfill their passions, but expected to share and rotate the lesser desired jobs. All members were subjected to trials of criticism, with its founding leader John Humphrey Noyes being subject to them on a few occasions, including scrutiny for his lustful temptations observed by many members. After being accused of non-consensual abuse in 1881, he was even exiled both from the community and later legally by the United States, where he attempted to bring his loyal followers with him to Canada and convert the community into a joint stock company. This essentially killed the communes, as hundreds decided to move to California to restart, while hundreds more abandoned the society entirely. But its complex societal structure, directly democratic institutions, and method of mutual critique made this separation from the leader mutually desired, preventing themselves from becoming a cult under his affairs. Those that traveled to California integrated into Orange County but could never kickstart a new commune into successful fruition. All of these communities have been labeled utopian, though I argue not for their desire for a better life, as one can never improve if a desire to improve is dismissed as impossible, but for ignoring the historical conditions that came before them. That being, the thousands of years of history affecting Jews and Christians in the Middle East and Europe that achieved their progress through dedicated struggle and by millions of martyrs. The simple freedom of thought and desire for a society not bound by the restrictions and sinful incentives that runs the rest of the world is one that has been forewarned by Jesus, who knew better than most in this endeavor, when he said, "They will seize you and persecute you, they will put you in prison, and you will be brought before kings and governors, all on account of my name. So you will bear testimony to me. But make up your mind not to worry beforehand how you will defend yourselves, for I will give you words and wisdoms that none of your adversaries will be able to resist or contradict. You'll be betrayed even by parents, brothers, sisters, relatives, and friends. They will put some of you to death. Everyone will hate you because of me, but not a hair on your head will perish. Stand firm, and you will win life." All lessons of the past and virtues of free thought from the era of Enlightenment finally began to refine in the 20th century. Some of the most critical, reasonable, and aware of the Christian socialists were the originators of the dialectical theology movement that began in the 1920s just after World War I. These originators were Emil Brunner, a Swiss theologian minister, and Reinhold Niebuhr, an American theologian minister. The two of them had the opportunity to meet through missionary work across the world, who accepted material reality as it was as gods and under God, and in their understanding of how intertwined religion and politics often were, used their Christian basis of understanding to analyze socioeconomics and political theory. They shared the Marxist observation of classes that held distinct conflicting interests, arguing that, as Reinhold declared, power is the servant of impulse before its master. In addition to believing that true collectivism, that is, collectivism without significant power dynamics, created the conditions for group rationalization in contrast to liberal society's alienating individualism. Reinhold in particular extended his beliefs on this and power that fascism was the desperate attempt to preserve capitalism by any means, as reactionaries cling to national fetishism in the face of a lifestyle where the emancipation of sin feels akin to the forcing against their liberties. Systems of conflict are inherently sinful according to Reinhold, as they incentivized power-hungry and power-retaining individuals who could overthrow the well-meant leaders and control society to reflect their interests also. This would be the ultimate evil, a major victory for hell, where ignorance from virtue becomes the new sin. As he concluded, with rather pathetic irony, modern civilization proceeded to tear itself asunder in its conflicts between nations and classes, while modern culture dreamed of perpetual peace. The only hope for a more just and peaceful world lies in the development of a democratic socialism that respects both the social nature and the personal freedom of human beings, and that seeks to balance the values of equality and liberty, of cooperation and competition, of solidarity and diversity. Reinhold Niebuhr is yet another one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s inspirations. His colleague Emil Brunner would follow, saying, "Capitalism is the most ingenious system ever devised for the exploitation of man by man and for the destruction of the natural foundations of human existence. The Christian faith is not a doctrine of individual salvation, but a message of social redemption. It proclaims the kingdom of God, which means the transformation of the world into a community of justice and love, in which the barriers of race, class, and nation are overcome." Being a regular visitor to America, Emil Brunner got to see the changes of America before, during, and after the Great Depression. While commending Franklin Roosevelt and his policies for alleviating the suffering of the poor and its regulations of banks, he believed that the New Deal was too dependent on cooperation with the wealthy elite, while also warning that the policies expanded the federal government's executive power that may erode civil liberties and what democracy existed in the government. Reinhold had a similar view in acknowledging the pragmatic benefit of reformism for the American people, while seeing the New Deal as too idealistic and optimistic in its assumptions of human nature, arguing that it had a tendency to centralize power in the federal government and undermine the autonomy and diversity of the states and local level powers. Between them both, they said, "The New Deal is not a new social order, but a new method of preserving the old one. The United States has assumed the role of the world's policeman, but has not assumed the responsibility of the world's judge. It uses its power to intervene in the affairs of other nations, but not to promote peace and justice of the world. The United States has become the most powerful nation in history, but it has not become the most humble or most wise. It uses its power to defend the freedom and security of the world, while using its power to advance its own interests and ideals. It faces the temptation and the danger of becoming a new empire, a new Rome. But as America wrote off the war reparations after World War II, that being the formation of the World Bank with indebted allies in addition to what was owned by the Axis powers, many mistook this economic revival and the compromises made with the New Deal as signs of successful capitalism. All the while, inflation grew, collapses continued, and the war to end all wars did the opposite, with the military-industrial complex across the world not helping. That is all to say that no one bothered to listen to the founders of dialectical theology, and died before their predictions and concerns became a reality for them to say they told us so. Probably what Pope Leo XIII had in mind when he made his criticism against American Catholics that dared to step out of line. Being a woman would have been enough to anger him, and being a Catholic anarchist might have given the Pope a heart attack. Dorothy Day was exactly that. A radical feminist among the massive suffragist sentinels of liberty, a journalist whose work was not at home being a child factory but instead working in programs that assisted the poor and homeless, and eventually, a hierarchy-critical anarchist who founded the Catholic worker movement in 1933. Some dare to call anarchy chaos, but in practice, the organization was a collection of autonomous chapters based on the teachings of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. They pushed for workplace democracy and cooperatives in the cities and helped establish agrarian communes on the countryside. The result of their efforts saw the establishment of 35 chapters, 200 communes, and thousands of refuge homes all across North America and Canada. While the group started to struggle after World War II as many of its members participated in the war, the organization with hundreds of communes still exists to this day. One of the most popular movements to challenge the New Deal was the National Union for Social Justice, a Christian organization formed in 1934 by Catholic priest Charles Coughlin that peaked at 7.5 million members, much of its popularity gained by its founder's radio show. The group ended when it merged into the Union Party that sought to challenge both the Republican and Democratic parties, as well as undo the disagreeable elements of the New Deal. Perhaps the most radical message spoken on the radio was, "We maintain that the economic system of the United States is fundamentally wrong and must be radically changed. We maintain that the existing system of capitalism has failed to provide the masses of the people with the necessities of life, and has resulted in the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few." And while seemingly insignificant as a number by itself, the Union Party took 2% of the US population's vote, which was roughly 4 million people at the time. When the movement entered a decline, Charles Coughlin unfortunately turned a 180 and switched support for the Christian Front, sympathizing with its anti-Semitic and Fourth Reich advocacies. Perhaps the American people dodged a bullet, as every crisis has its opportunists, but even so, it touched the hearts of millions, and many of the messages were true regardless. A seemingly unlikely ally to the Christian socialists, and one who did not turn into a Nazi, but rather survived Germany and contributed in the fight against it, Albert Einstein is neither atheist nor pro-capitalist, the former due to him saying, "I am not an atheist. I believe in a God who reveals himself in the orderly harmony of what exists," and specifically tackled the debate between science and religion in his lecture of 1939 that went, "Science can only be created by those who are thoroughly imbued with the aspirations toward truth and understanding. This source of feeling, however, springs from the sphere of religion, because knowledge of what is what does not open the door directly to what should be the goal of our human aspirations. All aspirations exist in a healthy society as powerful traditions, which come into being not through demonstration, but through revelation, through the medium of individuals. The highest principles for our aspirations and judgments are given to us in the Jewish Christian religious tradition." When a pastor asked Einstein about the afterlife, he answered, "I cannot conceive of a God who rewards and punishes his creatures, or has a will of the type of which we are conscious of in ourselves. An individual who should survive his physical death is also beyond my comprehension. Enough for me the mystery of the eternity of life, and the inkling of the marvelous structure of it. If people are good only because they fear punishment and hope for reward, then we are a sorry lot indeed." As for the latter, his anti-capitalism, he wrote what they don't teach in school about him, his On Socialism in 1949. Its passages emphasize his humanistic and critically religious character, which includes, "The economic chaos of capitalist society as it exists today is, in my opinion, the real source of evil. I am convinced there is only one way to eliminate these grave evils, namely through the establishment of a socialist economy, accompanied by an education system which would be orientated towards social goals. In such an economy, the means of production are owned by society itself and utilized in a planned fashion, which adjusts production to the needs of the community by the community, and would distribute the work to be done among all of those able to work and guarantee a livelihood to every man, woman, and child. The education would attempt to develop in them a sense of responsibility for their neighbor, in place of the glorification of power and success in our present society. Up to this point, we've seen it from all sides: the individuals, the masses, the devoutly religious to the more agnostic, and those from backgrounds of richness, poverty, illiteracy, science, and more. Like Einstein, Charles Coughlin, Dorothy Day, and the rest, a Brazilian archbishop shared their sentiments with the so-called progressive era, having observed it, declaring, "The New Deal was a courageous and generous attempt to humanize capitalism, to make it more just and more humane. But it was not enough. It did not touch the root of the problem, question the logic of the system, challenge the power of the elites, transform the structures of oppression, liberate the poor and the marginalized, nor create a new society based on solidarity and love." This was the same archbishop whose quotes opened this video, Elder Kumara, and his saintly actions from the Catholic Church makes Pope Leo XIII looks like a fascist in comparison. He grew up impoverished and radicalized early on, with a schoolteacher mother and accountant father, but at just 22, in 1931, entered the Catholic Church as a priest. In the same year, he founded the Sierra Legion of Work, which promoted and improved education and health clinics while also engaging with the labor movements in Brazil. Just 2 years later, he founded the Women's Workers' Catholic Union, and helping women gain independence from undesired and financially coerced marriages, challenged traditional gender roles by promoting women's rights to work according to their desires, helped women form unions to protect themselves from discrimination, and even pushed the church to consider empowering women into higher positions. All of this earned him the name Bishop of the Slums and the Red Bishop. In 1964, he became an archbishop, where he used his influence to challenge the Brazilian right-wing dictatorship of the time, as well as advocating for peasants to emancipate themselves and fighting financial institutions that took advantage of, and indebted the poor. The Brazilian government censored him, threatened him, and executed a few of his colleagues, yet he continued to defy and represent the oppressed, encouraging them to form small groups of gospel meetings where they could discuss organizing direct action against their government, and helped organize the Second Vatican Council where liberation theology was born. Liberation theology called for the mandated duty of the Church to represent the oppressed and challenge the oppressors. It recognized violence such as riots and rebellions as a natural and understandable consequence to such oppression, and declared openness to everyone as an equal, no matter their views or beliefs, including those who responded to oppression violently and those who denounced religion altogether. One of its proponents is Jesuit theologian John Sobrino, who became a Jesuit at 18, established an accommodating university in El Salvador, and criticized both its dictatorship and the US who helped propagate it in 1979. He survived a massacre that involved the death of 75,000 civilians, with he and many other Jesuits targeted. His direct experience helped him conclude, "The Church cannot remain indifferent to the violence that is the result of the unjust system that we have created. The Church must be the advocate of the poor and the oppressed, and must denounce the violence of the powerful. The option for the poor is an option for the life of the poor, and therefore an option against whatever threatens their life. This includes not only the economic, social, and political structures that generate poverty and oppression, but also the ideologies and theologies that justify and legitimize them. The option for the poor is also an option for the transformation of these structures by any means necessary, including violence if there is no other way." Another Jesuit is the theologian Juan Luis Segundo, who kept much of his life private, but based on his ability to travel to Argentina from his birthplace in Uruguay to study theology, displays the educated guest of an upper-class background. But despite this, it's perhaps his experience under Uruguay's American-backed dictatorship that radicalized him. Such criticisms leading to his persecution and forcing him to seek asylum in Spain for almost a decade until 1984, where he returned to South America to protest Argentina as well as the US-backed coup against the first ever elected president of Chile, Salvador Allende, who believed in a unique form of socialism that involved an automated digital economy, improved literacy, and decreased crime through rehabilitative and preventive programs. He shared similar sentiment with John Sobrino, saying, "The violence of the oppressed is not the same as the violence of the oppressors. The former is a violence of self-defense, of reaction, of a constant struggle for survival. The latter is a violence of domination, of exploitation, of oppression. The violence of the oppressed is a violence that cries out for justice. The violence of the oppressors is a violence that silences and kills them." Similar to Juan, the Catholic priest and theologian Leonardo Boff has not revealed much of his early life or upbringing, and yet had the opportunity to travel and study. and like Juan, also criticizes the injustices of South America. After criticizing the United States interventions, the authoritarianism in Brazil and Argentina, and the hierarchy and negligence of the main Catholic Church, he was forced into exile to Germany from 1986 to 1989. It was his belief that there is no true love of God that does not express itself in love of neighbors, and there is no true love of neighbors that does not involve commitment to justice and willingness to suffer for the sake of justice. Sometimes this may mean taking up arms to defend the rights and dignity of the poor. This is not a contradiction of the gospel, but a manifestation of the love that God has for the oppressed and the excluded. From a Catalonian farmer family, Pedro Casadaliga became a priest at the age of 24 in 1952, transferring to Brazil in 1968, conveniently when Archbishop Elder Kumara initiated the Second Vatican Council that founded liberation theology, where he became a prelate and bishop in West Brazil. Like the rest, he denounced Brazil, specifically advocating for the rights and autonomy of the neglected and oppressed indigenous populations, while founding the Indigenous Missionary Council in 1972. Death threats, assassination attempts, and the death of his friends could not dissuade his dedication to the Brazilian struggle, furthering this by refusing mandatory meetings in Rome with other bishops. A few of the assassination attempts were from former landowners removed from lands that belonged to natives. When eventually asked by the Catholic Church to retract his progressive views, he remarked, "My attitude is a reflection of the views of the Church in many regions of the world. I have criticized the Chiera over the way bishops are chosen, over the minimal space given to women, over its distrust of liberation theology and bishops' conferences, over its excessive centralism. This does not mean a break with Rome. Within the family of the Church and through dialogue, we need to open up more space." When the Jesuit theologian John Sobrino was criticized by the Church in 2007, he challenged it, arguing, "Real commitment to the service of God's poor involves the link between faith and politics." And in 2015, Pope Francis consulted him before issuing his own critique of consumerism and global warming. Our final liberation theologian worth exploring is from a family line of religious figures, brothers Ernesto and Fernando Cardenal, who followed as Catholic priests. In 1954, Ernesto participated in the April Revolution against the US-backed right-wing dictatorship of Anastasio regime in Nicaragua. He'd be ordained 11 years later, and when Nicaragua was attacked by terrorists in 1977, he helped the Sandinista National Liberation Front evacuate civilians and notified the National Guard before retreating himself to Costa Rica. His homeland fell to tyranny a year later, whose organization, the Contras, had been supplied, trained, and supported by the US whilst lying to its people. This radicalized the priests who joined the Sandinista National Liberation Front, a Marxist rebel movement that originated to repel French colonialists after World War II and returned to repel the far-right junta. This led him to say, "Christ led me to Marx. I'm a Marxist who believes in God, follows Christ, and is a revolutionary for his kingdom. The Bible is full of revolutions. The prophets are people with a message of revolution. Jesus of Nazareth takes the message of the prophets. Those revolutions failed, but others will come, and will continue trying to change the world." When Nicaragua was finally liberated by the SNLF, he became a cultural minister of the National Assembly for the new Republic of Nicaragua, where he helped restore lands for the native populations, protected and showcased much of their culture, while his brother Fernando became the Minister of Education who helped improve the national literacy rate substantially, inspired by advisors from Cuba. Both of the Cardinal brothers were excommunicated in 1984 by the Catholic Church, with Fernando defending, "I cannot conceive of a God who would ask me to abandon my commitment to the people. From my point of view, and from my personal experience, it is possible to live simultaneously with the Church as a Jesuit, a priest, and also devote myself to the service of the poor in Nicaragua." His banishment was lifted by Pope Francis in 2019, a few years after Fernando's death. A few of these souls go marching on in death, but many are alive to continue it in life, offering a real sense of justice in the world, and though suppressed in many Western religious discourse, are living examples of the compatibility between Christianity and the radically progressive. In attempting to answer the dichotomy of Christianity versus radical progress, we realize that the real dichotomy is one regarding power, a power with the right to declare rights themselves, to make dictations over interpretation, truth, and property, a dichotomy of the statists and their subjects and the attempt to keep them subjected versus the attempt to dictate themselves. And in this class conflict is a class war where the ruling class, whose interest is to reinforce the state apparatus to keep the right to dictate, have dictated what utopia means itself, revising it away from the one who coined the term amidst the peak of European civilization Renaissance period from Catholic St. Thomas More's Utopia. Utopia was not merely an ideal of society, but as historian Dr. Michael Segru put it, he does not intend utopia as a real-life possibility. He doesn't think that we could change England either this year or 100 years from now and turn it into something that's utopian like Plato's Republic. More's utopia is intended as a sort of yardstick. We may not find anything in this world that's perfectly 1 yard long, but the yardstick will allow us to figure out how long an individual thing that we find in the world is. He does not anticipate that this world would become perfect, but utopia does give the Christian humanist a standard by which to look around at the contemporary governments in the world and find them lacking. This is all to say that seeking a better world has been the foreground of Christianity. Whether you say it began with Noah upon landing the ship, Abraham with the finding of Canaan, Moses after Exodus, the Acts of the Apostles, or Thomas More's Utopia, it's undoubtable that the virtues of resistance, self-determination, and armed struggle are just as Christian as the more passive ones like love, equality, and shared responsibility, virtues that have long exceeded the lifespan of socialism, communism, or anarchism. Christianity is but one of the many ways class struggle is contrasted by historical and material conditions. The ruling class Christians that try to dictate what it means to be a Christian and the benefit of perpetuating the self-benefiting system, of religiously justified wealth, of the right to allow some level of exploitation and even the most progressive of Catholic distributism, or the working class that built everything they own, live in, and use, who seek not just the breaking of physical chains, but mental and spiritual chains as well. The freedom of thought and interpretation, returning Christianity from the organized hierarchical religion that it is, to the decentral localized religion that it was. Call it radical, call it progressive, but these roots are old, and they are far from foreign. It's continuing what has been fought for in the past since the death of Jesus, on earth as it is in heaven.